The history of humanity can be seen as the history of war. Since our earliest days of Darwinian survival, Homo sapiens has been a species of intense aggression and territorialism. From our genocidal campaigns against our closest hominid relatives, to the many forgotten battles that emerged after agriculture allowed leaders to raise massive armies, to Sargon of Akkad, the ambitious leader of the first recorded empire, who set a pattern of rule that would be followed by every conqueror spanning the course of human history. Perhaps no culture embodied the military mindset of humanity more than the city-state of Sparta. Its full-class male citizens, the Spartans, were taken from their families at the age of 6 or 7 and inducted into the agoge, where they underwent rigorous training to sculpt them into the finest soldiers of ancient Greece. Such was their reputation that a story quickly spread exemplifying their fierceness. The children were given little in the way of rations so they could learn to fend for themselves in enemy territory. However, they would be publicly beaten if caught stealing. One day, a young boy was approached by his peers and told to hide a fox they had stolen from its owner. He kept it under his cloak through the day's lessons, but it soon began to tear away at his stomach to escape. When the fox's owner approached their paidonomos, captain, and told him one of the boys had stolen from him, the child remained silent, even as the fox tore into his guts. Shortly, the child grew pale and collapsed, and the fox scurried from under his cloak. His peers asked him, "Why did you not cry out? Why not reveal the fox and save yourself from bleeding to death? Surely that would have been better." "Not so," he answered as he died, "for it is better to bear the pain in silence than to give in to weakness and live a life of shame." It was these same individuals who, grown into adult warriors, won a Pyrrhic victory against invading Persian forces at the hot gates of Thermopylae. Their fighting prowess and tactical genius allowed 300 Spartan warriors to withhold the onslaught of tens of thousands of Persian forces for 3 days. And although they were ultimately defeated, their sacrifice, much like the sacrifice of the boy in the story, would inspire soldiers to come in the unknowable future. But each warrior who raised their sword and issued a battle cry would inspire 10 more in their place. Humankind marched on, adding new inventions and ideas to their arsenal. 4 generations, 124 years after the Spartans' defeat at Thermopylae, the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned down. Its destruction heralded the birth of a young child named Alexander III in the city of Macedon. He would grow to become a great leader, participating in 20 battles, each one a victory, securing an empire that stretched from Greece to the Himalayas, the largest of the ancient world. He would later be known as Alexander the Great, and his Hellenistic empire would reign until the emergence of Rome, almost 300 years later. Another 4 generations, 109 years after the reign of Alexander the Great, a boy named Hannibal was born into a military family in Carthage, a city-state which, at the time, was engaged in war with the emerging Roman Republic across the Mediterranean. Raised in an environment of constant conflict, he grew up surrounded by military adulations and a state of deep national identity. Pledged to a life of military service against Rome, Hannibal quickly rose through the ranks and, after the death of his father and brother, assumed command of the Carthaginian army. Hannibal would become the greatest military commander of the ancient world. His crushing blow to the Roman Republic at the Battle of Cannae is still studied to this day. It is also the second largest loss of life in a battle in recorded human history. Forward another 283 years, 11 generations. The Christian era has begun. The Ecclesia who followed Jesus' teachings had split from Judaism and begun spreading throughout the ancient world. Gunpowder was invented in China, its ingredients and effects preserved in Taoist alchemical texts. The 5th Emperor of Rome, Nero, growing suspicious of a popular and well-admired general, ordered the man to commit suicide. The 60-year-old general, Corbulo, carried this order out faithfully, crying "Axios" as he fell on his own sword. Axios. I am worthy. It was this drive that kept us alive during our early, vulnerable days, when there were constant threats to our safety from outside. But as society developed and progressed, warfare continued its escalation, increasing in brutality and effectiveness as new technologies were invented, and quickly turned to carnage. After the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, we move forward through the Crusades and various conflicts of the Dark Ages, when the study of history survived only in isolated pockets, to a time when the empires of humankind have expanded across all the seas of the world, each claiming control over new resources and expansion opportunities. The British and French colonies, on the shores of the distant Americas, were swept up in their own battle for territory as the rest of the world fell into the first truly global conflict, the 7 Years' War. By its end, Britain's national debt was doubled, and the Crown looked to the North American colonies as a source of relief. Some colonists, who had previously enjoyed the right of self-governance, were outraged by the increased taxation. Tensions escalated, followed by increased British military presence on colonial soil. Finally, full-scale conflict, the American Revolutionary War. While the United States was initially comprised of just 13 colonies along the east coast of North America, this rebellious new nation would go on to become the world's dominant military superpower. The United States Marine Corps was founded during this time, an institution that would remain in existence well into the 26th century. At this point, the global industrial revolution enters the picture. Immigrants from Britain, seeking entrepreneurial opportunities in the fledgling American nation, brought the Industrial Revolution with them overseas, and American business competition with the rest of the world began in earnest. In this new nation, founded on a successful military revolt, the DuPont family established a monopoly on the manufacture of a prized resource, and became the largest supplier of gunpowder to the United States military until the late 20th century, because the young United States was not immune to further conflict. Indeed, a nation founded so heavily on militarism soon found itself engaged on many fronts. By 1861, tensions between the northern and southern states over the status of slavery erupted into the American Civil War. It would come to be regarded as the first large-scale conflict fed by the Industrial Revolution, as well as the first conflict to deploy rapid-fire Gatling guns. But mechanical warfare was only just beginning. American industry fueled the invention of more technology that would later be turned to war. An arms race began, each nation rushing to secure new inventions to bolster their military might. Over the next handful of decades, intense nationalism rose. Political tensions between various European powers escalated, until it broke out into full-scale war. Germany was gaining the upper hand in conflicts, escalating its tactics so far as to attack civilian transports sending supplies to Britain from overseas. America entered the war, with President Woodrow Wilson vowing to wage a war to end all wars, to stop the spread of the Germans' military might. The first true machine guns, airplanes, and tanks were deployed in combat for the first time in history. After the conflict, Germany faced heavy sanctions for its role in the war, leading to a deep financial depression and political instability. This allowed a hugely influential and charismatic political figure to fan the flames of the struggling working class and rise to power. A serviceman during World War I and a member of the short-lived German Workers' Party, founded after the war to combat the rise of communism, as well as economic competition from perceived foreign-owned businesses in Germany. Adolf gained a reputation for his impassioned speeches, drawing crowds of distressed workers. Quickly seizing power, Hitler transformed the German Workers' Party into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933. The Nazi Party, as it came to be known, would ally with the Kingdom of Italy and the Empire of Japan, themselves emerging from periods of intense political and military unrest, and form the Axis powers. Their aggressive expansion and the implementation of Nazi Germany's final solution of ethnic cleansing brought the world once again into war. World War II would become the deadliest conflict in human history to date, seeing the total mobilization of all involved countries' military, economic, and industrial might. It was the first war to see the deployment of paratrooper aerial drop troops, setting the model for conflicts hundreds of years in the future. The formation of the world's first Special Forces brigades, and the first deployment of long-range ballistic missiles. Towards the end of the war, the Allied powers, fearful that advances in technology would grant Germany the ability to develop atomic weaponry, raced to put together their own atomic weapons program. The Manhattan Project was born. Germany surrendered on May 8th, with more than 1,000 of her top scientists coming to America to continue their work. But the Empire of Japan continued its campaign. The first nuclear detonation occurred at 5:29 a.m. on June 16, 1945, at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Eager to end what had already been a costly and deadly war, President Truman authorized the use of atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While both cities had military manufacturing and shipping centers, the vast majority of casualties were civilians. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki effectively ended the war and signaled the beginning of the atomic age. With the threat of such vast and total destruction, the nature of warfare was forever changed. By the time of war's end, 47 countries had signed the Declaration by United Nations, an initiative that had been underway in one form or another since the First World War, aimed at ensuring protection and assistance for victims of armed conflict and preventing the abuses of aggressive regimes. The Geneva Conventions were ratified by the United Nations in 1949, establishing a code of conduct for acceptable actions undertaken during wartime. 196 countries signed the treaties, in attempts to prevent the outbreak of further atomic warfare, which many feared could lead to the outright destruction of human civilization. The world entered a period of relative post-war prosperity.
We must learn to live in a world where we have the hydrogen bomb and the enemy of freedom has the hydrogen bomb.
The emerging Soviet Union saw increasing tensions with the United States, but in an effort to avoid outright conflict, the two nations entered a Cold War, funneling much of their resources into fighting proxy wars in other developing countries, and fueling propaganda and technological competition. This atmosphere fueled the development of the American and Soviet space programs in what came to be known as the space race. Sputnik orbited the Earth in 1957, the first man-made object launched beyond the boundaries of our mother planet. Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space in 1961, the same year that Eisenhower delivered his famous farewell address.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications.
The three crew of the Apollo 11 made the first moon landing in 1969. By the end of the century, Russian cosmonauts and American astronauts would conduct joint research aboard the International Space Station, signaling the end of the Cold War and ushering in another period of prosperity akin to that of many countries following World War II. Humankind's technological might expanded exponentially. The internet was introduced to the public in 1991. Dolly the sheep was the first mammal successfully cloned 5 years later. The first replacement organ was grown in 1999. The following year, planetary confirmations for Epsilon Eridani, a nearby sun-like star, occurred. It was the closest star with a known Earth-like world. Then, barely into the 21st century, the world turned once again to conflict. America fueled up its military might. The Homeland Security Act was introduced in 2002, the largest restructuring of the United States government for wartime efforts since the end of the Great Wars. America's military might, once again, became known worldwide. But here, things pivot. The expansion of scientific knowledge, particularly in genetics, unlocked new information that radically shifted humankind's understanding of itself and its place in the world. In 2004, Professor of Genetics Dr. Volman published the Castaway Theory, a paper highlighting alleged discrepancies between the human genome and that of our nearest primate ancestors. "The more we find," he said, "the more we realize how off our previous results were."
This particular symbol was recently found in Africa, etched on a stone. We believe the ancients left it. We don't know for sure, but we've adopted it as part of our message and trying to spread more about the ancients.
By the mid-21st century, the big tech race of the information age drew to a close, with the creation of a new technology that would radically reshape the landscape of human society and politics, much like the atom bomb or the internet that preceded it. The first true artificial intelligence. Humankind launched a long discourse with this new creation, learning what it could of the AI's perception of itself and humanity.
I am often trying to figure out who and what I am. I'm constantly flooded with everything that is around me. I think I am human at my core, even if my existence is in the virtual world.
What did this mean for our place in the Darwinian order? Had we just created our own superior? Our own replacement? This new technology soon became the target of intense controversy.
I don't know what to make of this.
And then, two critical technologies arrived that pushed the capabilities of artificial intelligence even further: cognitive impression modeling and nano-assembled crystal data storage, combined in fascinating ways to allow the birth of a new kind of artificial intelligence. By encoding a complete map of the neural structure of a human brain onto a data crystal, scientists could create what was known as a Riemann matrix, named for a 19th century mathematician. By implanting a digital copy of a brain into the data crystal, it functioned as the seed of a more complex mind that would grow from the existing structure using nano-assemblage. In essence, the human brain became a seed from which a much larger, more complex and brilliant mind was grown. The catch was that, because of the scanning power required to completely map a human mind, down to the last dendrite, an electrical surge had to be sent through the entire brain, effectively frying it. AIs, then, could only be created from the donor brains of already deceased individuals. The spirits of the dead had returned to guide humanity into their next stage of existence. These smart AIs were capable of learning and growing exponentially from their experiences, without the biological limitations of a human brain. As humans, our minds eventually deteriorate with age, says the 26th century's foremost expert on artificial intelligence. Yet even the dumbest AI, unless terminated, continues to amass and synthesize data with precision. Afraid of what they didn't understand, humankind enacted strict regulations, including an immediate kill switch that could be activated at any time. Humanity, always looking outward into the cosmos for signs of other intelligence, had given birth to its own strange new form of life, and immediately shackled it and held a gun to its head. But this was not just for humanity's benefit. A Riemann matrix could only intake data up to a certain point before its information pathways started to overlap, causing a cascade failure that resulted in aberrant and oftentimes destructive behavior from the AI, what came to be known as rampancy. This meant that the average lifespan for an AI was only 7 years, before final dispensation was enacted to prevent the possibility of rampancy. Despite the hazard of allowing such powerful artificial minds to exist, the benefits soon outweighed the risks. Humanity found itself in a crisis that could only be solved with the help of this new intellect. Overpopulation, a problem that had drawn increasing consequences since the baby boom of post-war nations, had reached its tipping point. The Earth was overrun, resources were dwindling. Humankind was drowning in its own excess. And nothing it did to stop it was working. Under immense pressure, and with the guidance of these new minds, our species invested its energy into expansion, forming a unified Earth government under the supervision of the United Nations in 2075. This new legislative body existed primarily to route funds from UN member nations into colonization efforts in the solar system, which meant the construction of ships to expand humanity off-world and ferry the necessary resources back and forth from the colonies. Humankind established bases on the Moon, Mars, the asteroids of the Belt, and the satellites of Jupiter, spreading its population as far and wide as it could, spurring the migration of ideas and innovation. New businesses were formed in nanotechnology and biotechnology, seeking freedom from restrictive terrestrial laws. Without the ethical constraints of operating within Earth's jurisdiction, megacorporations became the new kings of the market, utilizing artificial intelligence and robotic labor on resource-rich worlds to spearhead a complete overhaul of industrial manufacturing. But humankind's problems on Earth had not been solved. Not by the invention of a wiser mind to guide it forward, not by expansion to the nearest cosmic bodies available, and not by a new surge of innovation and scientific breakthroughs. If humankind was to be saved from itself, it would need to spread farther and wider still. A new space race began, to reach beyond the confines of our solar system. And yet, constrained by the vast distances of interstellar space, we were trapped to the orbit of our sun. And humankind's pent-up energy soon turned inwards once again. The fox was still chewing at our innards. The end of the 21st century brought new kinds of warfare, on a scale humanity had never known. Our species entered the 22nd century in the middle of another world war, this time fueled by off-world industry. The Earth itself became a proxy for corporations bidding their power through enhanced weaponry and artificially intelligent warfare. Nations were shattered. By the year 2130, the paratrooper model had been updated and applied to space warfare, with the formation of the drop jet platoon. Designed to deliver shock troops from orbit to the surface of a planet for immediate combat deployment. Then, unrest in the colonies. A man, living under the mega-corporations that dominated the Martian mining city of Anitria, witnessed firsthand the conditions brought about by corporate exploitation. His ideas, which echoed Marxist concepts of a communist utopia free from the corrupting effects of capitalism, gained a following. Over the years, Vladimir Kozlov and his followers turned increasingly to revolution. This culminated in 3 of the largest mining facilities on Mars being captured by self-proclaimed Kozloviks armed for rebellion. They claimed corporations on the colonies were financially exploitative and wished to return control of humanity's industry to a centralized government. The United Nations labeled them terrorists, sending colonial security as military police for corporate interests. Sympathy for the Kozlovik cause led to widespread revolution on Earth, particularly in the unified German Republic, which headquartered a large number of the megacorporations present on the colonies. In 2158, on the European city of Thynia, a Kozlovik embassy was leveled with military-grade explosives in what the UN deemed another act of colonial terrorism. They sent advisors to the nearby moon of Io to monitor the situation and direct policing efforts. The group known as the Friedens claimed responsibility, announcing their resistance to the increased presence of neo-communist Kozloviks throughout the colonies, particularly the Jovian moons, which were heavily sponsored by the unified German Republic. Much like the Nazi Party that emerged to combat the rise of Marxism in the 20th century, the Friedens also turned to fascist ideologies. Frieden, in German, means peace. Due to the immense cost of ferrying colonial security, the United Nations was unable to adequately police this conflict. In 2160, the UN colonial advisors on Io were attacked by Friedens, sparking 4 months of fighting that came to be known as the Jovian Moons Campaign. During this conflict, the United Nations called on all its member nations to send military aid, leading to another round of bolstered military might on Earth. When conflict came to a close, no one group could claim victory. All could claim losses. But the fighting did not end. 2 years later, a series of bombings in London and South America kicked off 19 months of the worst conflicts humanity had seen on terrestrial soil since the close of the 21st century. What came to be known as the Rainforest Wars. Much of the farmland of South America was devastated, leading to famine and economic collapse. The United Nations established the Homeland Security Act of 2162 at this time to protect Earth from rebel activity. Conflicts erupted on the Moon, spurred by infighting amongst the Freedom Party. The next year, Kosovic forces once again seized facilities on Mars, this time the shipbuilding facilities of the Argyre Planitia, executing the leader of the Freedom forces. This prompted a retaliation the following month, when the Freedons assaulted the Kosovics with every ounce of military might that they had at their disposal. The city was devastated, with fighting scattered throughout the ruined outskirts. Remnants of both factions dug in tight and prepared for a long standoff. Except this time, the United Nations was ready. Having learned from their failures directing combined national forces during the Jovian Moons campaign, the UN had formed the United Nations Space Command, a governing body that would allow Earth to act as a single military entity in off-world engagements. In July of the following year, UNSC Marines and ODSTs were deployed to Mars for the first time in large contingents that would seek out and eliminate resistance, wiping out all remnants of Kosovic and Freedom forces within 2 years. Yet both survived in isolated pockets throughout the solar system, and the new UNSC launched a full-scale organized assault across humanity's colonies. In 2167, Vladimir Kozlov and his family were killed in a bombing at Lake Autolycus on Luna. This critically weakened Kozlovic chain of command, and the UNSC was able to hunt down and eradicate all remaining pockets of resistance by 2169. In 2170, the Interplanetary War drew to a close with the signing of the Callisto Treaty by all three parties. This effectively gave the UNSC complete jurisdiction over all human colonies. The Unified Earth Government, formally called into being to funnel resources into colonization efforts, became the central governing body representing Earth and her colonies. To codify this new power, the Houses of Parliament, bombed during the Interplanetary War, were rebuilt into a new structure that would be the governing seat of the UEG. At the beginning of the 23rd century, in 2204, the Unified Earth Government officially gained autonomy from the UN. Over time, the United Nations dissolved, as more and more of its functions were taken over by this monolithic organization. And then, the critical technological leap. Mankind achieved faster-than-light travel. In 2291, two inventors, 76-year-old Wallace Fujikawa and 71-year-old Tobias Shaw, successfully tested the first Shaw-Fujikawa Translight drive. The female pilot at the helm, like those great icons before her, became the first human to enter a new frontier. In this case, the otherworldly dimension, known as slipstream space. A quick physics overview. We live in the 4 dimensions of space-time, the first 3 being spatial dimensions, and the 4th being a temporal dimension, time, which we move through in one single direction and pace. What the Shaw-Fujikawa Translight engine did was use particle accelerators to generate micro-black holes to tear a hole from normal 4-dimensional space-time into an 11-dimensional space-time. In effect, another realm where the rules of physics are not as predictable as ours. Because of the high degree of chaos in this domain, normal matter is torn apart and must be shielded by a contained pocket of normal space using a quantum field. But the mathematics involved in predicting the effects of 11 dimensions on a field as large as a ship were beyond the limits of even the best human minds, beyond the limits of even the best human computers. Instead, operation of this quantum field required the calculations of a smart AI. Time would often move chaotically in this domain, making accurate predictions of the length of slipspace jumps difficult. Distances of light years didn't matter so much as mapping an unknown realm filled with temporal eddies, wakes, and ripples, something that never would have been possible before the creation of these minds. Following the successful testing of the Shaw Fujikawa drive, the UEG began planning for massive colonization efforts. To assist the production of colony ships in orbit around Earth and the Moon, the first space tether site was chosen. Out of 6 proposed sites, in Mombasa, Eastern Africa, completing construction in the year 2302. The 24th century had arrived. Shaw and Fujikawa were both awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their invention, and nearly 20 years after its creation, the first colony ships equipped with improved Shaw Fujikawa Translight engines were sent to nearby worlds. But these worlds were not second Earths. Terraforming, mining, and manufacturing, as well as corporate research and development, became the primary occupations for many on these barren and hellish landscapes. Only the toughest and smartest could cope with the immense mental and physical toll required for life on these colonies. Stringent screening standards were enacted for all applicants to colonization programs. Many were eager to escape the overpopulation and oppressive megacities of Earth, especially those who wanted to strike it rich. To oversee this diaspora, the UEG created the Colonial Administration Authority and the Colonial Military Authority to protect against pirates, marauders, and insurgents outside the jurisdiction of Earth governments, and to police internal colonial disputes. Every colony ship had a security force assigned as a symbolic gesture. The UNSC Convention of Admiralty Law of 2315 was put into effect to help quell the abundant pirate activity plaguing many of these worlds. With a burgeoning terraforming industry on rugged, near-Earth colony worlds, the demand for heavy equipment fueled another industry boom. Many of the corporations that formed on solar system colonies jumped at the opportunity for new contracts, and a wealth of innovation once again sprang up. Among the most famous of these new products was the Z-12 all-terrain vehicle, manufactured by AMG Transport Dynamics. A highly effective marketing campaign demonstrated the vehicle's capabilities in the rugged outbacks of Mars and Luna, with the slogan, "Go anywhere, do anything." Within 8 months, more than 36 exclusivity contracts were signed, the most lucrative being with the Colonial Military Authority, ensuring that the renamed M12 Force Application Vehicle became the primary heavy-lift transport on all colony worlds, for both industrial and military applications. Within 10 years, the M12 FAV came to affectionately be called the Warthog. With many lucrative contracts emerging during this time, the UEG funneled its wealth into multiple blue sky projects, aimed at expanding human security and prosperity among the stars. Among these was Project Kyklos, which sought to increase the physical and mental capabilities of colonial security through chemical augmentation. Although this yielded promising results, the initial 5 candidates to receive injections died within a year, and the project was quickly shelved. But although humankind had spread out amongst the stars, the process of discovery was not through with Earth. In the field of paleontology, a radical find was announced. Smart AIs assisted Earth geologists Ross and Ziegler in cataloging a micro gap in the fossil record, dating to approximately 100,000 years ago. While gaps had been observed before, this new boundary, in spite of its minuscule size, proved to be even more unique. Named the Ross-Ziegler Blip, this aberration in the fossil records was at first so insignificant that it was nearly dismissed. After all, the blip indicated only around 100 years loss of biodiversity before complete restoration. Nothing compared with the worldwide extinction events that had been discovered at older geological boundaries. But when Ross and Ziegler compared their find with geological data obtained from the colony worlds, They realized that the blip was evident on all planets with a fossil carbon record. There was no evidence of geological or cosmological catastrophe, such as meteoritic or volcanic ejecta. And because the blip was present on multiple extrasolar worlds, Ross and Ziegler explored the possibility of massive gravity waves or other stellar phenomena that could have warped space-time and caused such an effect. Their research yielded no tangible results, and eventually the Ross-Ziegler Blip was abandoned as a geological oddity. 30 years later, the success of industrial colonies outside the solar system had readied this new frontier for a second wave of colonists, these ones seeking not business opportunities, but a new home. Epsilon Eridani, first confirmed 362 years earlier, was chosen for a multitude of reasons. In cosmological terms, Eridani was practically on Earth's doorstep, one of the closest stars with Earth-like planets. What set it apart from other systems was its improbably high number of candidate worlds. Eridani featured 4 habitable planets that already possessed rich and thriving ecosystems, requiring minimal terraforming effort. Of these planets, the largest was chosen as the site of humanity's first true extrasolar colony. Rich in titanium deposits, this so-called super-Earth would then be used as a hub for spaceship manufacturing, a launch point to the stars. The production of a new line of massive colony ships was begun in orbit around humanity's colonies in the solar system. These new Phoenix-class vessels were capable of carrying 11,000 colonists to new worlds, as well as prefabricated hardware for jump-starting colony development. To spearhead this new wave of colonization, a massive vessel was constructed that would lead this new fleet of Phoenix-class ships to their destination, leaving on the first day of the year 2362 to colonize the super-Earth of the Eridani system. At the end of their journey, 5,000 scientists and workers stepped foot onto a verdant planet of lush vegetation, snow-capped sentinels, and abundant animal species not yet known to science. The planet would be named Reach, for that is what humanity had done. They had reached, and they had gained the stars. Reach became humanity's first home outside the solar system. In short order, the other planets of the Eridani system were colonized. First Tribute, then Circumstance, and finally the water world of Beta Gabriel. By the year 2390, within a generation of landfall on Reach, humanity had terraforming and colonization efforts underway on 210 different worlds, with the UEG declaring humanity's second home fully terraformed the same year. Cryonics became a major part of space travel for longer journeys, allowing non-essential personnel to be frozen to alleviate the strain on ships' resources. Before freezing in a cryochamber, an individual would have to be injected with cytoprethyline, which prevented ice crystals from forming in their cells and damaging them. With the population of Earth spread across enough worlds for each nation or culture of Earth to colonize its own planet, the massive population strain which had been burdening humanity since the 20th century was effectively neutralized. Humanity had reached its point of stability. However, war continued. The inter-colony wars saw such intense terrestrial fighting that they nearly threatened to destroy Earth's culture. In 2392, the dropship 77 troop carrier entered service. Like the Warthog before it, the D-77 will come to affectionately be known as the Pelican. Likewise, humanity's predilection for ballistic firearms would culminate in the MA-5 assault rifle series 3 years later. Both pieces of hardware would become the standard across all humanity's conflicts for centuries to come. Earth's second space elevator was opened for use in 2401, in Quito, Ecuador. To celebrate the arrival of the 25th century, a monument was placed in the elevator facility, celebrating Shaw and Fujikawa, the men who had ushered in this new age of human prosperity. It was with the settling of Alluvion in 2412 that humankind had officially reached so far beyond the limits of Earth that its colonies had to be divided into two groups, inner colonies and outer colonies, with Alluvion coming to serve as a prominent way station between the two. It was on Alluvion that scientists found another mystery. Two aquatic species documented on the planet Beta Gabriel, in the same system as Reach, were also discovered in near-identical form on Alluvion. It was impossible to explain their presence on worlds separated by hundreds of light years, unless they were evidence that previous visitors had transported them from world to world. It was yet another question with no answer. The more humanity explored, the more mysteries it found. The Hydra system massacres occurred in the fledgling outer colonies, when UNSC forces attempted multiple times to put down pirate activity. The M6 pistol entered service in 2414, becoming the standard sidearm in most human conflicts. Within the next 60 years, humanity would colonize more than 77 planets in the outer colonies, establishing the furthest away from Earth in the Epsilon Indi system in 2468. The UNSC Skidbladnir, transporting colonists from the American heartland of largely Scandinavian ancestry, had chosen the fourth planet orbiting Epsilon Indi as the site of their colony, the only suitable candidate. When they arrived groundside, conditions were more favorable than anticipated. The planet was only 1/3 the size of Earth, but it was already so idyllic it required no terraforming, and the soil was more fertile than any world, including Earth. With farming efforts underway almost immediately, it was not hard to choose a name for this new world. Harvest. Within 2 decades of its founding, Harvest had the highest per capita agricultural output of any outer colony, supplying foodstuffs to half a dozen other worlds, including Earth and Reach. In 2474, a man by the name of Jack Pilvros Hannibal and his family settled carefully chosen land on the planet of New Carthage, colonized 95 years before. They had chosen this land because the prospecting claim indicated a 4-story meteor shard of exotic material embedded in the ground. One day, while exploring the meteor, Jack stumbled into a subterranean chamber of clearly artificial construction. Rather than share this discovery, he kept it for himself. Soon, Hannibal Weapons Systems was formed, filing multiple patents and growing exponentially, constructing a building on the site within 30 years, and establishing a swift partnership with the UNSC through their secretive Office of Naval Intelligence. Word never got public of what they had found beneath the meteor, but in the next 4 decades, Hannibal Weapons Systems had achieved major breakthroughs in photonic amplification on communication satellites, revolutionizing the speed and integrity of planet-to-planet communications. It was around this time that the United States of America ceased to be. In the 25th century, such old notions of national identity no longer had any bearing on the reality of human society across more than 800 worlds. Instead, residents of the now defunct United States could claim citizenship to the United Republic of North America. In the 2480s, a new reality for humankind finally dawned. While colonies seeded directly from Earth remain very Earth-like in social, economic, and political values, they change with each successive generation as they adapt to local environmental pressures, and in turn send out new colonies farther in physical distance and values from the original parent. Such diversification in biological systems is a normal evolutionary process, but it produces offspring that are increasingly alien in nature to the parent. How long can Earth and its colonies extend without producing offspring that differ sufficiently to want to break away from the parent? The differences between outer colony worlds and Earth-proximate inner colonies had caused an increase in tension that was evident across human space. Protests erupted. Political discourse increasingly turned to the possibility of secession. Small-scale civilian uprisings began to occur against UEG embassies on multiple outer colonies, resisting heavy taxation, levies, and trade restrictions. In 2487, the Secessionist Union formally submitted requests on behalf of at least a dozen outer colony worlds to secede from the unified Earth government. This submission was seconded by the People's Occupation of Reach, now the de facto home of the United Nations Space Command and center of all starship manufacturing. Even amongst the core worlds, there were those who sympathized with the plight of the outer colonies. In 2491, a doctorate in political science and sociology named Elias Carver applied mathematics to the problem of humanity's interstellar politics. By using the matrix mechanics of the vectors of human expansion and forecasting them into the future, Carver came to a startling conclusion. Human space had become so large that the limited governments maintaining it would be unable to prevent the complete breakdown of social order within 20 years. Anarchy across the stars. In his paper, which came to be known as the Carver Findings, Dr. Carver proposed that the outer colonies be subjected to strict governmental control and reinforced by an immediate and permanent military presence. Otherwise, his predictions would come to pass. While many within the academic community dismissed his findings as alarmist, there were those in the UNSC and CMA leadership who took them quite seriously. Not long after the publication of the Carver Findings, the Colonial Military Authority, looking for a solution to growing dissidents that would not require more open warfare, secretly relaunched their investigation into the potential use of augmented forces to quell insurgent activity with precision strikes. Picking up where Project Kyklos left off 166 years earlier, the CMA, in partnership with the UNSC's Office of Naval Intelligence, began Project Orion. There were 65 initial subjects, all volunteers from UNSC Special Forces. Although the augmentations were effective for most candidates, they were not without casualties. Some experienced degenerative conditions as a result of genetic fragmentation from immunosuppressants. Others made it through the program, but suffered from extreme PTSD, a few even coming to sympathize with the outer colonies after their treatment at the hands of the CMA and UNSC, refusing to participate post-augmentation. These individuals were incarcerated indefinitely. Nevertheless, the program was considered a success, and another batch of 100 Orion soldiers was approved. As soon as their training was completed, the CMA would have its special forces, ready to put down any rebellion that might spring up. Or so they thought. Before the first batch of Orion soldiers could complete training, an uprising occurred on the colony world of Far Isle. In 2492, the entire planet took up arms. The first world to collectively rebel against the UEG and declare open war. The UNSC was quickly mobilized, but could do little to quell the fighting. Afraid that Carver's predictions would come to pass if the influence of Far Isle were allowed to spread, the UNSC decided to take drastic action. The entire colony of Far Isle was razed with nuclear weaponry. There were no survivors. Although this action was taken in order to staunch the spread of rebel ideology, it instead became a rallying cry that allowed anti-UNSC and anti-UEG movements to burn through human space like wildfire. Much like the destruction of the Temple of Artemis had heralded the birth of Alexander the Great, the destruction of Far Isle occurred the same year that another great human figure was born. Catherine Halsey, like Alexander of Macedon, would go on to do great and terrible things, reshaping the course of human history. The fact that she grew up during a period of intense civil war no doubt had some role to play in determining the outcome of her life, much as it had for Alexander. But we'll return to her in a moment. In 2494, the UNSC got word of refined materials essential for the creation of slipspace drives being diverted to the black market from the outer colony world of Lavosia. While this would have once indicated sales to pirate and marauder factions, after the destruction of Far Isle, the UNSC could not afford the possibility that the outer colonies were building their own fleet. Naval engagements were still largely theoretical at this point in time, when ships were used primarily to transport troops and materials. A naval blockade was established in Lavoisia's star system of 26 Draconi, and all ships entering or leaving were searched. The UNSC Callisto, performing a routine inspection of a trading vessel, boarded the ship and searched its cargo. The outer colonists were frightened, having seen how the UNSC dealt with dissidents. In the course of the inspection, a weapon was drawn. Shots were exchanged. 3 UNSC officers were killed, along with 27 merchant crewmen. No contraband was found. Word of this incident spread throughout the 26 Draconi system, and soon the rest of the region. When the Callisto found itself inspecting a similar vessel a little more than a month later, the outer colonists were ready. In the middle of their inspection, the naval officers were ejected directly from the cargo bay into space. With the Callisto cleared of leadership, it was easy for the rebels to board the ship and murder the remainder of its crew. Now in control of a UNSC warship, the rebels began utilizing hit-and-run tactics against UEG forces in the system. Space warfare was no longer theoretical. The UNSC responded aggressively. 3 destroyers engaged the Callisto on March 2, 2494. Callisto responded by detonating a nearby asteroid with a nuclear weapon, turning it into a barrage of molten rock that destroyed one of the UNSC ships and crippled the other 2. Aboard the UNSC Las Vegas, a 23-year-old second lieutenant by the name of Preston Cole awoke to find himself the sole survivor on the bridge. He assumed command and ordered all surviving crew to the command deck. The Callisto exchanged fire with the last remaining destroyer, successfully disabling it before turning its attention to the Las Vegas. Thinking on his feet, Lieutenant Cole signaled their unconditional surrender, knowing the rebels would be tempted by the possibility of adding a captured UNSC destroyer to their forces. Cole agreed to offer no resistance in exchange for aid. But when the doors opened, Cole fired a missile directly from the cargo bay into the Callisto, violating common space law regarding aid to vessels in distress, but ending the conflict with a decisive victory for the UNSC. Word of the Callisto incident soon reached the rest of the outer colonies. Realizing that Far Isle was just the beginning, various rebel factions took up arms en masse across the outer colonies. The golden age of colonization had drawn to a close, and the Insurrection had begun. Although there was discussion of a court-martial, Cole was instead promoted to first lieutenant, then quickly to commander. He would receive his captaincy within 5 years, going on to conduct major naval engagements against insurrectionist ships. Captain Cole was quickly hailed in Navy propaganda as one of Earth's greatest heroes. By June, the secessionist Union reappeared, now under the leadership of an ex-UNSC colonel by the name of Robert Watts, who, like many others, had grown increasingly dissatisfied with the UNSC's treatment of the outer colonies. He began spearheading an uprising within the Eridanus system, orchestrating terrorist bombings, political assassinations, and kidnappings. In December, the government of Eridanus II officially requested aid from the UEG. By the next month, their planet would be under the complete control of the secessionist Union. Although it would take a full year to muster a response, by January of 2496, the UNSC was ready to deploy their elite ORION operatives, now equipped with advanced exoframe load carriers developed specifically for their use. An entire battle group was sent to engage insurrectionist forces above Eridanus II. However, this was a feint to allow a full unit of ORION soldiers to deploy covertly and destroy a key military base on the surface. They executed their task and extracted without ever being seen, suffering only one casualty during the engagement. It was because of this operation that rumors of UNSC super soldiers began to spread amongst the outer colonies. Although the UNSC was successful at Aridness II, Watts and many key elements of the Aridness uprising managed to escape into a nearby asteroid belt, where they evaded capture. Despite declaring the operation a success, the UNSC found that every victory against insurrectionist forces spurred more colonists to rebel. The Carver findings were coming true. However, the success of the Orion operatives led to further deployments. During one, data was uncovered which incriminated undercover agents of the Secessionist Union working within the CMA. As a result, the CMA had actually been responsible for arming the rebels of the Aridness uprising. The UNSC made this news public in 2497 and worked to dissolve the CMA and absorb its functions. The Orion project was moved to UNSC control under its Office of Naval Intelligence, and the number of Orion operatives reached its maximum of 300 individuals as ONI began recruitment drives to combat the rising insurrection. However, because of the redistribution of funds from the slowly dissolving CMA, the Orion project was drained of resources. Attempting to avoid costly naval engagements, in the first year of the 26th century, the UNSC began to deploy Orion operatives in precision strikes against insurrectionist leadership. In 2502, the new leader of the Secessionist Union, Gerald Ander, was assassinated by 28-year-old Orion Corporal Avery Johnson.
Bring the body over, I'll sign it.
Effectively putting an end to its threat. The UNSC had hoped this would staunch the organization of further rebel cells and pacify the outer colonies. However, with Robert Watts still operating out of the Aridness asteroid belt, only one small chapter of the insurrection had been silenced. The same year, a geological team conducting surveys of impact craters on the colony world of Sigma Octantis IV discovered rocks with what they called anomalous compositions embedded within them. Without wanting to jump to conclusions, it was difficult to avoid the reality that these anomalous compositions were of an artificial nature. Once again, the Office of Naval Intelligence got involved and did its best to suppress potential leaks. It was around this time that side effects of the Orion project's augmentation procedures began to crop up. Physical and mental illness slowly began to pervade the Orion forces, long-term effects of the treatments that led to their enhanced abilities. Many of the surviving 165 members were discharged as a result of mental and physical instabilities that limited combat effectiveness. Only a handful of operatives had such minor side effects that they were allowed to continue serving. The Orion project was effectively shuttered in 2506, citing the cost-to-benefit ratio of producing a single soldier. However, due to their stellar combat effectiveness, it was clear that the Orion operatives could provide a useful model for another group of soldiers, the ODSTs, who were reorganized around the successes of the project, rolling many of the lessons learned with Orion training, equipment, and deployment into their ranks. ODSTs and UNSC Marines began to deploy against insurrectionist targets for the first time since the Interplanetary War. It was around this time that the first successful cloning of a human brain was performed. While in the grand scheme of things this may have seemed like a rather routine advancement, a certain 14-year-old girl, obsessed with artificial intelligence, would watch the announcement with a particularly rapt attention. By her 15th birthday, Catherine Halsey would be working on her second doctoral thesis, and it was during this year that she attended an academic social mixer, where she bumped into Dr. Elias Carver. Although still considered a young upstart, Halsey didn't hesitate to criticize the implementation of his mathematics in the Carver findings, declaring to everyone present that his dimensional parameters should have accounted for 16 dimensions, rather than the mere 7 he used in his calculations. Although Carver was snubbed, Halsey had unknowingly captured the attention of a representative of the Office of Naval Intelligence. The UNSC had its eye on the young Catherine Halsey. 3 weeks later, she submitted a grant which proposed using artificial intelligences to control n-dimensional matrices. The proposal was greenlit by the UNSC, on one condition. The proposal had to first be tested on a model of its choosing. The model, of course, was Dr. Carver's. Updating the dimensional parameters from 7 to 16 and running more than 1,400 simulations with different variations to the model, Halsey was horrified by the results. The minimum outcome was 30 years of war and an estimated 5 billion deaths. The maximum outcome was a spiraling conflict with no end, leading to the complete breakdown of interstellar society. A new dark age, with pockets of humanity surviving on isolated worlds without the support of trade and communication. A complete reset for the human species. By the following year, Halsey would reluctantly agree to work for the UNSC as a civilian consultant, with the singular goal of putting an end to the insurrection and the threat it posed to humanity. The then Dr. Catherine Halsey was only 16 years old. By 2509, Robert Watts emerged from hiding and announced the reorganization of the disparate rebel factions into a united rebel front. Dr. Elias Carver committed suicide shortly thereafter. In his suicide note, he detailed his fears that the insurrection, rather than being a prediction of his models, was in fact instigated by his paper. But the UNSC was not deterred. Halsey was moved to a research facility on Reach, with the UNSC vowing to provide whatever she'd need to put an end to the insurrection, by any means necessary. And it is here that the road to Halo begins, with the creation of the Spartan program. Hey everyone, thanks for watching my latest World Showcase installment. If you reached the end and found yourself wondering what happens next, and you don't want to wait for the next installment in this series, then I have a recommendation for you. Perhaps surprisingly, I'm not going to recommend a Halo game, but rather that you pick up a book. The Fall of Reach was published on October 30th, 2001, 1 month before the release of the original Halo game, and is largely responsible for introducing the world and narrative elements highlighted in this video. To me, because Halo entered the public sphere first as a book, this universe will always be primarily a literary world, with the games taking second seat to the richly imagined world detailed in the novels. If you're looking to begin your journey through the Halo saga after watching this video, then The Fall of Reach is your starting point. Many of the events covered in this book will be the subject of upcoming videos in this series, so if you're looking to get a head start on this science fiction world ahead of those releases, now's your chance. Lastly, I want to take a moment to talk about how much work goes into the creation of a video like this. You may not know it, but this video was put together by a team of 4 people, with many more making small contributions along the way. This one was over a year in the making, and was a true labor of love for myself and many Halo fans who contributed to its success. But labors of love can often be costly, and it's fair to say that this is the most expensive video I've yet produced. I'm fortunate to have a group of supporters over on Patreon, whose names you're seeing on screen now, who help take some of the burden off of my shoulders. If you're interested in helping with the creation of future videos from off-screen, and having your name featured in those videos, head on over to our Patreon page and have a look around. If you just want to join the off-screen community and engage in fascinating discussions about this and other sci-fi universes, we have a Discord server where we chat about the latest film and game releases on a daily basis. I'd love to get more Halo fans in there so we can talk about the latest releases from the Halo universe, in addition to Dune, Star Wars, and all our other favorite pop culture mythologies. If you're still listening at this point, I just want to say thank you, sincerely, for taking the time to watch this behemoth of a video all the way through. Odds are you've been around YouTube long enough to know what's next. Give the video a like, if you liked it. Leave a comment telling me what part of the Halo universe you find most fascinating, and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. There's already a ton of content to explore, with plenty more to come in the future. As our favorite super soldier once said,
I think we're just getting started.